Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes with me, your host this week, Katy Balls. Coming up on the show, is Britain in for a big economic squeeze? The government's autumn statement today promised spending cuts and tax rises, but who will it hit the hardest? Our politics team, Kate Andrews, James Forsyth and Isabel Hardman, join me to discuss. For the first time in the Ukraine-Russia war, a missile hit NATO member Poland. Now seen as a misfire from Ukraine, how will Poland react to this? We speak to Ukrainian reporter Illia Ponomarenko and Spectator journalist Lisa Haseldine. The unrest in Iran intensified this week as the number of protesters detained passed 14,000. What began as a movement to ban the hijab has turned into a wider revolt against the Islamic Republic. Activist and writer Mansoureh Shajoee joins me to discuss what the future might look like. How deep does corruption stem inside the Metropolitan Police? Is it the odd bent copper, or is the problem more systemic? We'll be speaking to Tom Harper, author of Broken Yard, The Fall of the Metropolitan Police, which was reviewed in the magazine this week. And now, across the pond, the announcement American pundits have all been predicting. Donald Trump has declared he is standing to try to be the presidential election candidate for the Republican Party in 2024. But why was the announcement so rushed? To discuss, I'm joined by Freddy and Jacob Heilbrunn. And finally, as Christmas approaches, are Santa's grottos becoming a thing of the past? Journalist and author Laurie Graham thinks so. She joins me on the show to discuss her own efforts. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, then do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of the video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. First up, today brought the much anticipated autumn statement. For the cover piece this week, Kate Andrews looks at Britain's big squeeze, who is going to bear the brunt of the government's new fiscal plan. She joins me now, along with our politics team, James Forsyth and Isabel Hardman. Kate, in advance of the autumn statement, you've had Jeremy Hunt using multiple interviews to say it was going to be very bad and he was going to be Scrooge. Was it as bad as we expected?
It's pretty bad. It is also what we expected after the Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng mini budget had so many surprises in it, which, including shocking all of us, shocked the markets and sent the market spiraling. Unsurprisingly, they decided not to really pull any rabbits out of hats. So we got what had been billed, actually a little bit less than what had been briefed and considered in the weeks leading up to the autumn statement. But the main headline is that the Chancellor is practicing a consolidation of £55 billion, and this is coming from about £25 billion worth of tax hikes and £30 billion worth of spending cuts leading up to 2027-28. The biggest tax is that major stealth tax, which is a freeze on thresholds for personal income, for national insurance contributions, and for inheritance tax. This is expected to drag over 1 million people into the 40p tax rate or above. The threshold for the 45p tax rate has also been lowered, which is a direct rebuke of the mini budget in September. Liz Truss wanted to abolish it altogether. Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt have actually dragged more people into that tax rate. Overall, this autumn statement takes the tax burden to a post-war high. And very worryingly, we're looking at the biggest fall in living standards in post-war history. There is no doubt that the combination of inflation and these tax hikes and these spending cuts is going to cause a lot of financial pain. What the government has succeeded in doing is getting the government back on track when it comes to its fiscal rules, when it comes to getting the public finances back in order. But of course, the question over the next couple of months and indeed years is whether or not that fiscal pain is going to be tolerated by the public.
Isabel, what message was Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak ultimately trying to convey when it came to the autumn statement?
Well, in case we missed it, Jeremy Hunt made sure that he told us by saying he's had two priorities. So one was that those who had more would contribute more, and the other was ensuring that there would be growth and continued investment in public services. And as Kate has just said, that there was obviously that very strong briefing before the autumn statement that this was going to be really difficult, but there was a lot of emphasis within the statement on public spending, particularly with regards to education and the NHS. In fact, one of Jeremy Hunt's only jokes, I think, in the statement was where he talked about suggestions made by the former chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee, who'd even written a book on the topic. He was obviously talking about himself, for workforce forecasting for the NHS. And he then also pointed out that the spending increase that he was announcing was something that Amanda Pritchard, Chief Executive of the Health Service, had said would be sufficient to keep the health service going, so sort of trying to ensure a kind of buy-in. And then on education, he really used the language that he used to use when he was Health Secretary in terms of talking about the workforce in the teaching profession. He thanked the teachers for the brilliant job they were doing and said that spending on education was going to go up as well. I thought it was significant there that he mentioned the legacy of Michael Gove, trying to remind the Conservatives of things that they have to be proud of over the past decade and a bit of their time in government. So overall, it was I wouldn't say it was an upbeat statement, but as we'd been expecting, it was a more forward-looking and constructive statement than the sort of briefings of doom beforehand had suggested it was going to be.
And James, there was also an attempt, wasn't there, to almost show some leg when it comes to Labour or park tanks on their lawn, when it comes to two new consultants' advisory roles?
Yeah, so Patricia Hewitt, who was a health secretary under the last Labour government, she will advise on these integrated boards that do both health and social care. And Michael Barber, who founded Tony Blair's delivery unit, will advise on skills. And I think you saw with this extra money for the NHS, this extra money for schools, an attempt to show that, look, yes, we're having to do some unpleasant things, but we are putting more money into schools and hospitals. I think the big question is whether the Tories can get back to their public service reform agenda. The Tory party used to talk about delivering more for less. In recent years, it has felt like it's been less for more. And I mean, the big question is whether they can make this spending go further and whether they can tackle some of these problems. Because if you can't get better value for money out of public services and get some growth going in the economy, then the tax burden is going to end up going ever higher, and that is going to depress the economic growth.
And Isabel, when it comes to the parliamentary party, it was interesting how Jeremy Hunt was ultimately pointing very heavily to global factors, though he did make one remark about how when it came to the Liz Truss Kwasi-Kwarteng era, you could not, it was dangerous to borrow for tax cuts, just as it was for spending. But do we have much of a sense of how this is landing in terms of Tory MPs, if those on the right are going to wear it?
Well, we obviously had the threat yesterday at Prime Minister's questions from Esther McVey that she wouldn't support the tax measures in the autumn statement if HS2 went ahead, which Hunt confirmed it would do today. So perhaps we'll get a rebellion from her. But in terms of a wider rebellion, I think there's still a possibility that might not happen. So Simon Clarke has been tweeting about the need for supply side reform. He hadn't gone as far in his threats as Esther McVey anyway, but there was certainly an attempt by Hunt in his speech to underline that these were Conservative measures. This was the sort of things that Conservatives do, just not so much to attack the Labour Party as Chancellors tend to do, but actually to remind those on the benches behind him that this is a Conservative government, because one of the complaints when Hunt's boss Rishi Sunak was Chancellor from people of a similar persuasion to Esther McVey was that there weren't many Conservative policies being unveiled. That was partly as a result of COVID, but the pressure to cut taxes, cut spending from the right of the Conservative Party, it certainly added to the popularity of the Liz Truss pitch during that first leadership contest in the summer about unfunded tax cuts.
Kate, finally, there's plenty for MPs on the right to dislike about this. If you look, for example, at the new changes to the windfall tax, the plan to bring in much more revenue through that metric. But in terms of how things are going to feel over the next few years, ultimately you have the OBR saying this is going to be a big fall in living standards over the next 2 years. Is it going to be very drastic? Is it something where even if Tory MPs back it now, both Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak are going to be facing more requests for funding in the coming months?
A cynic might say that part of the design of this autumn statement was to make it the worst it could possibly be, because it can only go up from here. You know, if some of these measures do add a little bit of growth to the OBR's forecast, then perhaps Sunak and Hunt can start rolling some of these measures back, even introduce a tax cut or two, the closer we get to an election. But I think maybe there's an element of that, but mostly I think it was a very honest statement. That wake-up call that has been coming, that all of the money, not just that we spent in COVID, but all of the money that we pledged for pensions and healthcare long before COVID hit, through successive governments, Labour and Tory, and coalition, meant that at some point we were going to have to pay for it. And I think that this statement is sort of that first real indicator that these costs are catching up with us, and that the era of cheap borrowing is over, at least for now. And if you can't borrow this money, it's not just that the rich are going to pay. I mean, the rich are certainly paying more, but everybody's going to be paying for it too. One of the really worrying factors from the OBR that we've dug into are the inflation figures, and it looks like the average inflation they're expecting for next year is still going to be 7.5% roughly, so well above the bank's target of 2%. So that combination of tax rises and inflation persisting is really going to make the next year, at least, very difficult. And, you know, I have some sympathy, I really do, as much as I hate tax hikes. As much as I don't like brutal spending cuts over a short period of time, I think it makes them less thoughtful. You can have a lot of sympathy for this government trying to get the public finances back on track, given not just what happened during the Truss era, but the global phenomenon of rising interest rates and higher borrowing costs and the rest of it. I think the difficulty, however, for Sunak and Hunt now is that in this autumn statement, you still saw some very serious giveaways. They still haven't touched the triple lock on state pensions, a quarter of which are going to millionaire households. There's still more money for the NHS, despite in his own statement, Jeremy Hunt basically suggesting the Scandinavian systems and the Singaporean systems are better for providing healthcare. And so whilst they're willing to be very honest about the state of the public finances, we're not having the honest conversation yet about the actual public services that are requiring these additional taxes. They disproportionately are going to benefit the pensioners. And, you know, it's a core voting bloc for the Tories, no doubt. But I think it's becoming harder and harder to deny that the decisions being made have a real electoral slant. And if you are under the age of 40, certainly if you're not on the property ladder yet, there's very, very little in this autumn statement for you. It's just bad news. It's just bigger taxes, more tax hikes, and handing over more of your income to the state. And, you know, again, I think there's a really big question about how long you can do that before it severely backfires.
And Kate, just on that final point you made about the young, I mean, we've heard from Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt that they want to say that, in contrast, I think, to the not so many budget by Liz Truss, that this autumn statement is about looking after the most vulnerable. That's been a clear focus. The wealthiest are going to have to pay the most. But which group do you think does come out worst when you look at the measures? Is it the young?
Well, we're still breaking it down, but the marginal tax rate for everybody is going up. I mean, even if you are a very low income earner, if you don't own your home, if you're not receiving certain kinds of benefits, if you're not receiving the pension yet, again, there's very little in here for you. So if you are in one of those protected groups that's classified as vulnerable, I wouldn't say that it's the best budget for you, because if you are genuinely vulnerable in one of those groups, times are still going to be really tough. I think the difficulty is what is still being classified as vulnerable includes millionaire pensioners. And we know from Sunak's time as Chancellor that behind closed doors, going back to 2020, he was actually pushing to reform the triple lock on state pensions. He thought that was the time to tackle the unfairness of that policy and the extent to which it was benefiting people who actually didn't always need it. And it's clear that he's not ready to do that yet. Now, in my piece for the magazine this week, I spoke to a government insider who made the legitimate point, and I'm paraphrasing here, that you can't get the public finances back on track and make those difficult decisions and reform all the public services at the same time. That's just politically not feasible. And, I really do take that point. But the problem is that this government is operating not on borrowed time, but on limited time. The next election could be 18 months away. And we know that Sunak is keen to reform, but whether or not he can, when he's actually in charge, I think will be a big part of what ends up defining his legacy.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Isabel. And thank you, James. As the world leaders met in Bali at the G20, a missile was fired into Polish land, killing 2 people. Initial reports accused the Russians, sparking an emergency NATO meeting, but it's now likely it was a Ukrainian missile. After the success in Kherson, is this a problem for Ukraine and Polish diplomacy? I'm joined by Illia Ponomarenko and Spectator contributor Lisa Haseldine. Illia, what do we know at this point?
So what happened yesterday was most probably the aftermath of the Russian missile attack against Ukraine, because last night they fired close to 100 missiles against Ukrainian critical infrastructure all across the country, in Kyiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Lviv as well. And judging from the latest things that we have learned from the scene and the pictures of the debris, one of the Ukrainian air defense missiles that was trying to intercept the Russian missiles incoming, 2 of them most probably fell down on the Polish soil. We do not know if they successfully intercepted the missiles or if they failed to do so. But anyways, the pictures of the debris from the scene suggest that that was the Ukrainian air defense missile from the S-300 missile system. So that was probably what was happening.
Lisa, since ultimately those reports first emerged, we've had a situation where Western leaders have been very keen to urge caution. So ultimately saying the conflict, Russia is to blame. But when it comes to these missiles, let's not jump to conclusions. Actually, as we've just heard, they could have been Ukrainian. And therefore, ultimately, this idea that we should respond because of NATO, hold breath. But how's it gone down in Russia when reports first emerged?
So the response in Russia has actually been quite interesting. So when the news first broke, I think there was some confusion amongst sort of Kremlin spokespeople and the state media around how to respond. So you had some people like Margarita Simonyan, who is quite a prominent sort of propagandist, basically come out gloating, sort of saying, Poland, how do you like that? That sort of message. Then it began to emerge that the Russian state media was taking a different tack. So a couple of hours after the news broke, the Russian Ministry of Defense came out with a statement denying responsibility for this missile. And that, I think, really set the tone for then how the rest of the propaganda machine, the rest of state media began to sort of talk about it. So suddenly the line was, well, no, it's not us. We are not responsible. No way. And any sort of leader, because obviously there were lots of world leaders gathered at the G20 who were sort of giving comment on this. Any leader who sort of gave any comment saying either hold fire or no, actually, once more details began to emerge, we don't think this is necessarily Russia. You saw a lot of reports emerging in the press saying, oh, actually, you know what? Yeah, look, see, they are saying that we're not responsible. We should listen to them, which I think again is quite interesting because it's not often that you see them necessarily agreeing with what Western leaders have been saying. But then obviously there's the conspiracy theory angle as well. So the Russian Ministry of Defense, in their statements, denied sending any missiles to that part of Ukraine that's close to that part of the Polish border. And you then began to see, particularly amongst the Russian military blogger community, these theories sort of being bandied around saying, well, the Ministry of Defense has said they haven't sent any missiles, so it couldn't even possibly be Ukrainian air defense systems that were up in the air because there were no missiles for them to knock out of the sky. So what option does that leave? Is it a provocation by Poland itself, which was also part of the Ministry of Defence's denial? So yeah, it's been a mixed picture, but ultimately one where the Russian press has fallen behind the state to sort of deny any involvement at all.
Illia, what significance do you think this has in terms of the wider conflict? Because, of course, until now it's been a contained conflict. And even if this is a misfire, do you think the fact that missiles have now led to Polish fatalities is going to lead to a change in mood when it comes to who should be doing what?
I don't think that there's going to be sort of a groundbreaking events or significant shift of mood towards the war, because the public opinion has been established regarding the Ukrainian situation and the Russian war in general, especially in Poland. Poland remains one of the most fierce supporters and advocates of Ukraine, obviously out of obvious reasons. The thing is that, yes, it's a very confusing, very strange incident. Even from the technical point of view, it's absolutely possible. It's not an unusual situation when it comes, to warfare. It happens all the time, but this time the debris ended up being on the Polish soil, which is technically, it's very surprising still, because the Ukrainian missiles, air defense missiles, they have the mechanism of self-destruct if they fail to intercept the incoming missile. So most likely they will be simply destroyed in the air and then fell down without bringing any harm. But nonetheless, most likely something else happened. In general, I don't think that it's going to be a huge impact on this, especially given the fact that obviously it was not an intentional Russian attack on the Polish soil. It was definitely not the Ukrainian conspiracy to bring Poland and NATO into World War III against Russia. It was something that happens all the time during this war since day one, and will be happening until the very final day of the final hour of this war, which is tragic. Lots of tragic things are happening on the margins of warfare.
And Lisa, I know you've been looking at Russian media in some of your coverage for The Spectator. Do we have any sense yet of where almost the mood of the nation is when it comes to Putin's efforts? Because we're obviously seeing lots of reports which are, ultimately the fact that the Ukrainians are making some gains, making some wins. Is that feeding back in terms of the public mood in Moscow?
Yeah, so I think there are definitely beginning to be some shifts. I think the important thing to say from the outset is that in terms of any official way of gauging the mood in Russia, it's very difficult to do, because it's impossible to basically conduct any sort of trustworthy polling, gauging sort of a real sense of how Russian people are thinking or what they're saying can be very difficult, obviously, again, because of censorship laws. But yes, I think there is. There have been reports of Russian mothers travelling to the Ukrainian front to try and persuade their sons to desert, to come home. Putin's failed partial mobilisation efforts as well have really had a knock-on effect domestically. People... there are petitions that are cropping up for to the government to try and sort of repeal some of those mobilisation orders. So, yeah, I think there is a sense that perhaps drip by drip, sentiment in Russia is changing about the war.
And Illia, now that Ukraine has taken back Kherson, clearly there's been heralded as a big victory. We have a tough winter ahead. Are we any clearer on what the end game might be to all this?
It's very, very hard to make any clear predictions, especially given the fact that the war has so many surprises. It's so obscure, and the fog of war is so thick. So maybe we should be talking not about predictions, but about possibilities of what's happened. By analyzing the pace of the war and how it's going, and by talking about trends, I think we can realistically, optimistically talk about the possible end of the war probably by next summertime. Probably. Why? Because obviously the Kherson victory and other victories on the front line, Ukrainian victories, they have demonstrated that the pace of the war has been reversed. Ultimately, now it's Ukraine that's prevailing, slowly, painfully, but it's prevailing. The verge has been reversed. And the winter time is coming, of course, and the nature of winter warfare will slow down the hostilities. It's going to be more about logistics, the war of logistics, the war between two sides in terms of whoever is best prepared for winter warfare, logistics and supplies, and also the war in civilian rear. The constant war between Russian missiles and Ukrainian workers trying to fix the energy system and keep the country afloat. Then the springtime comes. Most probably the springtime campaign would be crucial, would be defining, and probably maybe we'll get something that could be treated as the Ukrainian victory by summertime. The most important thing in here is that Russia needs to be denied of its ability to go on to waging this war in terms of offense and also defense. When it's not capable of doing that, the war is over, and it's time for negotiations and some negotiated end to this war.
And Lisa, what about Russia's position when it comes to global affairs? Because we just had the G20. Putin did not attend, but how did Lavrov go?
Lavrov got the cold shoulder. So he went as Putin's representative. Putin, it was announced last week, wasn't going to go. And pretty much from the off, tensions were pretty high, I think it's fair to say, at the summit. Sort of even before the main summit kicked off, US and China had a sort of bilateral where she had again sort of condemned Russia's threats to escalate in a nuclear fashion. And then, of course, during the summit itself, pretty much any world leader that got the chance to speak took it as an opportunity to have a pop at Russia, including Rishi Sunak, who, with Lavrov in the room, said that basically Russia needed to end this barbaric war and get out of Ukraine.
He also gave him an angry stare, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
If quick to release the photo of.
Yeah, exactly. If looks could kill. And then, of course, even countries such as India and China, as I mentioned, who have always, up until now, pretty much, I guess, supported Russia, or at least not actively condemned its war in Ukraine. Even they're clearly beginning to feel uncomfortable about the current situation. Modi and Xi also spoke out on things like the fact that Putin has been controlling grain exports in the Ukraine and weaponizing food stocks as a result of that. Modi also basically said that the G20 was a good opportunity to try and make progress in terms of reaching some sort of, or beginning rather, some sort of negotiations on the war. So Russia did not have a good G20, put it that way.
Thank you, Illia. Thank you, Lisa. Iran's protests intensified this week, sparked initially by the death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman who was detained for wearing her headdress inappropriately. The last 58 days of demonstration have seen more than 14,000 arrests and 320 people have died. Why was this week crucial to the movement? I'm joined by Mansoureh Shajoee, a writer and Iranian women's rights activist. Mansoureh, thank you for coming on Spectator TV this week. The situation in Iran has heightened further when it comes to the protests. Can you update us on what's been going on?
Actually, the Women Life Freedom is a movement, is an ongoing movement. And this week, it's very intensive because this week is the anniversary week of protests called Bloody November. Really Bloody November in 2019. After the government announced that the gasoline price is rising, in this protest, spreading more than 100 cities. The protest quickly extending into opposition to Wali Faqih, Ayatollah Khamenei, Ali Khamenei, and, take not only about the gasoline price, but also about the lack of justice, lack of freedom, and the opposition against the dictatorship. About 1,500 people were killed among Iranian protesters. Nowadays, the ongoing movement, Women Life Freedom, is linked with this anniversary.
When it comes to those protests over the hijab, you mentioned obviously the women's rights protests. We've had a situation this week where 272 lawmakers of 290 have ultimately voted to implement the death penalty for crimes against the state. Do we have any sense of how that is being met with the public in terms of support or lack of?
As supporters of the Women Life Freedom movement and in Iran and around the world, call for dissolution. The Revolutionary Court and shame trial and demand that the death penalty sentence should be stopped. We asked all of the community, international institution, human rights institution, to support us. And simultaneously, a public appeal is turning among the social media, and up to now, more than 100,000 signatures has been ratified.
Do you think the threat of execution for taking part in these protests will work as the Iranian regime wants it to reduce the number willing to go out there and protest?
I can say that the measure of the pressure, the measure of the injustice, the measure of the lack of dignity of life and humanity in Iran, and the measure of women's pressure, women's discrimination, is more than the sense of fear, the sense of and people want to be brave. Bravely, they took a street. However, they know that yes, of course, the execution could be a very, very, very horrible risk. That's why we insist to call and to ask the human rights institution to help us to support the protester and to do something to stop this shame trial.
And just finally, when it comes to these protests, how much of this is about the hijab and how much is this about a more general fight for freedom and rights? The start point was hijab, but now it is a general, coalitional, and inclusive movement, and you can see a lot of social group, ethnic group, religion group, laborers, students, a lot of people join this for women life freedom. And freedom, the third part of the slogan, freedom, it's a general freedom for women and men. Thank you for joining Spectator TV today. We've heard a lot about bent coppers, both fictional on TV and in real life, following high-profile cases like Stephen Lawrence. But how deep does corruption feed into the Metropolitan Police, and at what point does it start creeping in? Journalist Tom Harper has just released the book Broken Yard, The Fall of the Metropolitan Police, which was reviewed in this week's magazine. He joins me now. Tom, thanks for joining Spectator TV this week. Your new book is reviewed in the literary section of the magazine about the Metropolitan Police. When did it become corrupt?
Well, I think the Metropolitan Police has always been corrupt, as most major institutions have been. I think what's changed in the last few decades is the public have become more aware of some of the more serious issues for various reasons. Coupled with that, there's been a worrying decline in standards and supervision and training, which has also contributed to things getting pretty bad.
And I suppose when it comes to this creeping corruption, I mean, we see lots of things today, recent reports about the behaviour of MEP officers themselves. But are there a few moments that you think the point where it particularly worsened or were changing points in this?
Well, I started journalism just around the time of Jean-Charles de Menezes' death in 2006, and I started covering the Met at that point, and that was a big moment for me. I was very shocked at what happened around that. You probably remember an innocent Brazilian man was shot dead by counter-terrorism police on the streets of London after he was mistaken for a terror suspect, and in the aftermath of the event, the Metropolitan Police put out lots of information in an apparent attempt to muddy his name and sort of justify what they'd done, which I just couldn't really believe. And so that was a big moment for me. And also speaks to what I think is probably the major problem with the Met, is its defensiveness and its willingness to be dishonest about certain things, which, although not the most serious things in the grand scheme of things, obviously there's much more serious corruption, organised crime and so on within the Met, but it's that sense of dishonesty and lack of accountability and unwillingness to admit mistakes, which I think has ultimately eroded the trust between the Met and the public and the politicians that oversee it to such a great extent.
And what was it that ultimately triggered you to write this book? Was it incidents like this, or was there a moment when you thought this is something which deserves, we as journalists obviously write plenty of articles, but deserves dedicated time to it?
Yeah, I mean, well, you probably know, Katy, as journalists, we cover all these different stories and write, 700 words, 1,000 words or whatever, and move on to the next story. And I just felt that there was a narrative there within what I'd covered over the last 15, 16 years covering the police, where things were happening and we covered them and then we moved on, and the public moved on, the media moved on. And actually, I thought if someone tried to pull it all together and try and make some sense of it in one narrative, that might be interesting to readers, and I hope it is.
Now, there have recently been efforts to ultimately, crack down on this. So the anti-corruption unit, Mark Riley, the new commissioner, has been speaking about. Do you think this is going to make a big difference from what you've, tracked in terms of what's been happening over the past few decades?
I think Mark Rowley is saying the right things, and as I've said previously, I wish him well. I think we should all wish him well. I think we all, as a society, need the police to be a far stronger and far better functioning institution than it is now. So I wish him well. I do have serious reservations about his ability to deliver some of what he's saying. The police are still woefully underfunded, in my view. There's been a terrifying decline in standards and training over many years, which means, in my opinion, a lot of the police don't really know what they're doing. The recent events over the Just Stop Oil protests, I've said recently that they're standing around not wanting to enforce the law, and they don't seem to know the laws that they're able to enforce. These protesters sort of shutting down the M25 and so on. They're committing criminal offences. Whatever you think about climate change, the police could have arrested them and moved them off the roads quite easily for obstruction of the highway and criminal damage, but they don't. And I think until more officers feel empowered and also are properly briefed on what they're able to do and what their powers are, I think they will struggle.
What do you think it's down to? I mean, obviously you're talking about funding. When it comes to the Just Stop Oil protests, for example, do you think there's a worry that if they do something, the leadership may not have their back, there is a complaint and so forth?
Yes, I think some of the people I interviewed for the book spell this out very clearly. There's a very troubling loss of confidence overall amongst police officers, and serious concerns that they will fall foul of the media or their senior officers or regulators or politicians. And it's almost like they don't really want to make any mistakes, so they won't do anything at all. Obviously, that's a sweeping generalisation, but there's that general sense that it's probably better to just stay in the police station, looking at social media, rather than getting out onto the streets and actually affecting change and cutting crime.
So when it comes to what can be done, I think, of course, first to ultimately bring an end, or at least reduce the level of corruption in the Met, but also in terms of some of the behaviours you're talking about. What do you think the steps are? One thing you talk about is the idea of returning to patch reporting, which the reviewer questions.
Yes, my understanding of what he said is I was calling for a return to increased use of criminal informants, which is sources within the underworld that the police officers recruit and obtain information from. And that was a long-standing practice over decades, and has fallen away to a great extent. And the reviewers criticised me for calling for that, saying I didn't understand that a lot of the corruption in the police came from that very relationship between informant and handler. I felt that I tried. It's a complicated situation. I did feel that I said that that is absolutely where a lot of corruption came from, and it's not an easy path to take. But I do feel, to some extent, the complete lack of informants in the Met, it could be seen as sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You know, that they're so terrified of informants and that handling process where things can go horribly wrong, that they're just not dealing with them anymore. And we do have a lot of technical expertise in our ability to intercept communications and so on and obtain intelligence, but human informants are an absolutely vital source of intelligence to the police and the security services, and to not really have many, if at all, anymore, I think is a big mistake.
And just finally, P.F. King, in his review of your book, talks about a particular type of British corruption that we can see in various ways, one being the number of Etonians in public life. But I wonder, when it comes to the Met Police corruption, do you think that it is possible to, root out, nearly all corruption, or is that actually an impossible task? What is the goal here?
No, I don't think it's possible to root out corruption completely. The Met is an organisation of something like 32,000 police officers and several thousand back office staff, so you're always going to get individuals who are compromised or individuals who have low ethical standards. But I think so much more could be done. I think it's a long way back to something approaching normality. I think to some extent the police have stuck their heads in the sands collectively for about 20 years on corruption and not done a lot to try and tackle it since about the early noughties, late 90s. So to turn that oil tank around will take some time. And
in terms of the public, if they lose confidence in the Met, do you think that makes this task even harder because you have to go further to win it back?
Absolutely. Public confidence is vital for all sorts of reasons. And I think the public's confidence in the Met and policing more generally has been severely shaken, not least amongst women, which is obviously more than 50% of the population, with the terrible events around the Sarah Everard murder alone, sort of ostracising large swathes of the population. But yeah, I think that they desperately need the support of the public. And, despite everything, I hope the public do continue to try and support them, because it's a symbiotic relationship, really, law and order, and the police and the public. And we've all got to work together to try and get this country in a better place.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
After months of speculation, Donald Trump confirmed that he does plan to seek the Republican nomination for 2024. However, what are his chances, and has he rushed the announcement? To discuss, I'm now joined by Freddy Gray and Jacob Heilbrunn. So Freddy, Donald Trump is back. He is trying to make Trump 2024 happen. Are you surprised?
Not really, no. I think there was a little bit of doubt was cast about. I spoke to some people who speak to Trump, as people love to say, on a regular basis, and the last week, and I was struck that they sounded a little bit more dubious, a bit more doubtful. I think there was a little bit of disappointment, disgruntlement with the midterms, and his feeling that maybe Project Trump isn't going so well. But if you look at it, if you pan out a bit and look at it more broadly, Trump has never really stopped campaigning for the last 10 years, really. He has always done these rallies. When he was in the White House, he did the rallies. Pretty much as soon as he was out of the White House, he was still doing the rallies. The fundraising has always carried on. It's a business. The Trump campaign is a business. And the incentives for it to carry on are very strong. So I think it's no real great surprise that he announced.
Jacob, do you think that the timing of this is related to the midterms? Because lots of people were questioning Trump's electoral appeal. You look at some of those results, some of the candidates who are so closely affiliated to Donald Trump. Has it meant he's rushed forward this announcement to keep momentum going?
He has indeed. The timing was unpropitious, just as his speech fell flat at Mar-a-Lago. The difficulty he faced was he had anticipated, as many Americans had, that there would be a red wave, which turned into barely even a ripple. The idea was originally that he would emerge as the triumphant victor from the midterms, that the candidates that he had endorsed, particularly for the Senate, would win. Instead, almost all of them crashed and burned, including in Pennsylvania, where Mehmet Oz, the doctor that he endorsed, lost to John Fetterman. These defeats were ignominious for Trump and have triggered an incipient civil war in the GOP over him. He felt he had no choice but to try and position himself in front of it by declaring his candidacy now. The difficulty for him, I think, is that in declaring prematurely, the sizzle is gone. He's going to be campaigning now for 2 years. Ron DeSantis in Florida will wait and let Trump essentially burn out over the next couple months.
And how do you rate Ron DeSantis' chances, Freddy? Is he now ultimately seen as the most likely pick, or do you think that Donald Trump still has a decent shot at this?
I think the bookmakers are now making him the favourite. I think that might be a little premature. Jacob makes a very good point that Trump is now going to be campaigning for too long. And people do seem to be a bit exhausted with him. Even some of his old fans are getting tired of him. But DeSantis is not quite the perfect candidate that everybody thinks he is. Nobody is the perfect candidate. And he is very much an old establishment Republican at heart. And Trump will attack him as a rhino. That means a Republican in name only. And those attacks might be unfair, but they will certainly stick. And I think people will see that DeSantis embraced Trumpism. There's this very famous, embarrassing campaign advert he did where he sort of showed himself reading Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, to his baby. He was just sucking up to Trump in a big way. And people will see that DeSantis embraced Trumpism because it was the smart, clever thing to do. They might think he's not really a true believer. That said, DeSantis has been a very clever operator as governor, and we shouldn't underestimate him.
Jacob,
can I interject?
Yeah.
I have to correct Freddy on this
Okay.
point.
Please correct Freddy.
Let's stand ready to be corrected.
To call DeSantis a rhino, I don't think is fair.
I didn't say he was. I said Trump will call him a rhino.
I think it will be very difficult for Trump to do that. There's one big reason. He is going to campaign to the right of Donald Trump on the COVID issue. He's going to say that Donald Trump was responsible for the lockdowns, that Donald Trump stood by Anthony Fauci. He will pummel him on that, and he will say that in Florida, by contrast, we did not order lockdowns, we kept the schools open, and we did not kowtow to the federal government headed by both Donald Trump and then Joe Biden. So I think DeSantis will put Trump in a difficult position. I'm not saying that he necessarily wins the nomination. He does have some weaknesses. But I think it would be very hard for Trump to tar him as some kind of a closet liberal Republican.
I take that point, and I think Trump is weak to his right on COVID stuff, notably the vaccine mandates. Candace Owens, who was a sort of Trump sycophant for a long time, has come out recently and sort of declared that she felt he treated her unfairly because she dared question him about the vaccine mandates. And so I do think Trump is weak to his right, and there's a little bit of disenchantment on the right. However, he is the godfather. He is Trumpism. Without Trump, you don't have Trumpism. So a lot of these essays being written at the moment about the future of the right is Trumpism without Trump. That's nonsense to a certain extent because it's a non sequitur. He is the father of the movement.
Jay, what about Donald Trump's legal issues? What impact is this going to have on his campaign?
Well, his obvious attempt is to defuse the legal issues by depicting himself as a victim of a rogue Justice Department that is out to demolish the Republican front-runner for the presidential nomination. I don't think that that tactic will work, and I think he is going to be facing legal liability. It will, however, intensify his bond with the Republican base. I think it will cause him more difficulties with mainstream Republicans because it's likely to be more than one indictment. But we'll see. The Justice Department has not moved ahead yet and would need to have an ironclad case on the documents that he spirited away to Mar-a-Lago. And Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, has been exceedingly cautious in making any public statements about Trump. So right now, we're in a state of suspended animation.
There is this interesting dynamic, though, isn't there, Jacob, that the Department of Justice and the Democrats behind it, they do want to persecute Trump for the reason that they want Trump to run. So it helps them if they can create this conspiracy theory, if they can make the conspiracy theory true that they are out to persecute Trump, because they think their best ticket for winning is for Trump to still be around.
Well, I personally do not think that the Justice Department is out to persecute Trump. In fact, if you listen to the Democratic base, they're howling that Merrick Garland is a sniveling coward who doesn't have the cojones to go after Trump. I think it's all overdone. Biden has kept himself out of this. If this were the Trump administration, yes, I'm sure Trump would be baying for his adversaries' heads. In fact, we know that Trump tried to sic the IRS on his opponents, according to his former chief of staff, John Kelly. So I think
you think the Mar-a-Lago raid is purely in the interest of justice and preserving presidential...
The question isn't why they went into Mar-a-Lago, but why they waited so long. They gave the guy every opportunity in the world to cough these up. The man is pathological. Whether he did it for reasons of ego or because he wanted to sell the documents, I don't know. But the whole thing is utterly bizarre and consonant with Trump's presidency, which was, let's face it, a debacle.
And just finally, when you're looking at those midterms, ultimately the Democrats had a better than expected performance. So what does that mean for Joe Biden? Are the Democrats now stuck with him when it comes to the next election?
Well, Joe Biden reportedly has a spring in his step this week and is in excellent spirits because he feels that he's been vindicated somewhat by these results. I think the Democrats should probably not be quite so dreamy about what's going to happen. It looks like America's about to enter a double-dip recession. The broader outlook for the next 2 years does not look good. And Joe Biden's performance is generally seen as bad. His job approval ratings are low. The right track, wrong track meter in America, the vast majority of Americans think their country is on the wrong track. I think they could feel some pain in 2024, particularly if they think that Project Biden is working more than it actually is.
I couldn't disagree more.
Okay, excellent. Let's go.
I know you're shocked, but I've been a Biden bullish on Biden since the beginning. I think he is not a burden on the party, but he is the only Democrat that can defeat Trump again. He will run again, and he will win in 2024.
Can he defeat DeSantis?
That would be a rougher road, but the Republican program, as the midterms show, is not that popular. So I think Biden would have a strong chance, yes.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Freddy. And finally, it may be mid-November, but Christmas preparations are well underway. As children start writing their wish list, will they still want to meet Santa in his grotto? And should they? Journalist and author Laurie Graham writes about this in the magazine. She joins me now. Laurie, thanks for coming on Spectator TV this week. Now, you've been working recently on Santa's Grotto. Tell me, what does a Santa's Grotto in the year of 2022 involve?
Well, it's a bit sad, really. Sort of uphill work. So we decorated our grotto with empty cardboard boxes wrapped in Christmas paper, basically. It's early November, so. What I wasn't sure was exactly what Santa would be allowed to do because, strange men, young children these days. And also, whether children, if children were brought and the parents were going to have to pay for an audience with Santa, whether children actually want that these days. I mean, Santa starts appearing around about the end of August now, doesn't he? And also they have all these other figures in their lives, so that Santa doesn't have any kind of magic, I imagine.
Do you think then, in a world where there's so much screen time or, access to the web, video games and so forth, Santa's lost some of his allure?
He must have done. And I tell you something I saw actually just yesterday. It was an advent calendar, and it's in the shape of Father Christmas. And behind each of the little 24 doors, there's a tiny plastic figure of a superhero. So Santa has just become a kind of vehicle for the stuff that kids really want.
When it comes to festive figures, however, in your piece you do write that elves are back in vogue. What's behind that? Is it because you mentioned Elf on a Shelf,
Yes.
which Rishi Sunak, I think, has spoken about. The current Prime Minister.
Does he have one?
Yeah, he has had one that he has spoken, which I think is used with his daughters are big fans of it, or at least when they were a bit younger. And then you also have Elf, obviously the classic Christmas film, which never seems to go away. I've just come back for a flight when it was suggested as one of the films I should watch, despite it being November.
Yes, Elf in the movies. That's rather a nice figure. I must say, my grandchildren do not object to the elf on the shelf, even though they're old enough now to know exactly what's going on. But I thought it was a bit sinister. He's like a knock. He's noticing if you're being naughty and reputedly reporting back to Santa. Not very nice, is it?
So what is going to be in the grotto to entice the children?
Just the man himself. In fact, our grotto has happened since I wrote the piece for Spectator, and I must say he was a wonderful, very credible Santa Claus in stature, and his beard was genuine. It wasn't it wasn't a strap-on bit of cotton wool, but he didn't have a lot of takers. Business was slow, and so from time to time he walked around and said yo ho ho or ho 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 or something like that. I think it's kind of a dying profession. It's a bit sad. I'm really hoping that lots of people are going to write in and say, Laurie Graham's got this completely wrong.
So you had a Santa who had lots of time for rest, and children who, were they more interested in other Christmas activities? What do you think, from grandchildren, also the children at your event, is now the most exciting thing about Christmas for a young child? Is it presents?
Yeah, it's stuff. It's stuff. It's knowing what they want, and they do know, and knowing where you can get it. So, there's no excuse for the stuff on their list for not appearing. They've become very savvy consumers, really.
So if Santa's grottos are going out of vogue, at least for now, barring a huge intervention from Spectator readers, what do you think could be done to either reverse the trend or bring in something new, which is probably less present orientated?
Yeah, well, I suppose they'd love to meet Shrek or something in it. So if you want an experience, I don't know, maybe it's not really for children anyway. Maybe it's for the grown-ups. Personally, I have been to a grotto once as a child, and I can remember my mother's high expectations on my behalf, and I was actually terrified, and so I was a disappointment to my mother, or it was a disappointing thing for her. But I think maybe we just do it for ourselves, taking my grandchildren, mostly too old now, but I've got the final batch of younger ones coming through. I can't imagine myself taking them to meet Santa, but I suppose they might like to meet Spider-Man or...
And you might have not had a great experience back in your youth, obviously still very youthful, when you went to Santa's grotto. But did you, Len, if perhaps this is more for the parents, the grown-ups, the adults, did you enjoy your grotto finally?
No, not really. No, I can't say. I mean, I do think, to sort of go back to what you just asked me, that, you know, the figure of St. Nicholas, it's a lovely story. And, you know, he was a real person. And maybe we just need to, I think December 6th is his feast day. You know, he was a lovely old bishop who went around leaving secret, you know, bit of money for people who needed it and so on. So I would hate for us to lose that. Maybe that's what we need to lean on a bit more now.
Thank you, Laurie.
You're welcome.
That's it for this week. Once again, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. That's everything for this week. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.